Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining today's event, Introducing POPLAR, the Future of Psychedelics Law and Regulation. POPLAR is the project on psychedelics law and regulation, which we launched on June 30th. I'm Mason Marks. I'm a senior fellow and the project lead of POPLAR. I'm also a law professor at the University of New Hampshire Franklin Pierce School of Law. The Petrie-Flom Center is delighted to bring you this event with generous support from the SciSay Foundation. Before we get to the discussion, I'll mention a few housekeeping items. We welcome audience questions for our panelists, so please submit your questions. Throughout the event, I'll be pulling those questions to pose to our panelists. You may be wondering, how do I submit those questions? The best way is to use the Zoom Q&A feature. If you scroll to the bottom of your Zoom window, you'll see a small button marked Q&A. Just type your question there, and I'll be checking that frequently. You're also welcome to submit your questions on Twitter using the hashtag POPLAR. That's hashtag POPLAR. If you do submit a question there, Petrie-Flom staff will be monitoring it, and they'll pull it into the Zoom Q&A feature. Ways that you should not try to submit a question include the raise your hand feature on Zoom. We won't be using that today. We've also turned off the chat function so that our panelists can really focus in on the discussion. If you're interested in this event and others like it on health policy, bioethics, biotechnology, and related topics, we encourage you to sign up for the Petrie-Flom Center newsletter and to read our blog, The Bill of Health, which features cutting-edge commentary by legal scholars. I want to thank the POPLAR team, especially Laura Chong and Chloe Reichel, for making this event possible. Thank you also to Tim Ferriss and Matt Mullenweg, who support POPLAR through the SciSay Foundation. With that, let's launch into the symposium. In about 10 minutes, we'll welcome our keynote speaker, Rick Doblin. But first, we have a very special guest to open the event. US Congressman Earl Blumenauer was a vocal supporter of Oregon's historic Measure 109, which, when approved by voters last November, legalized supervised administration of psilocybin in Oregon. He's also been an advocate for reforming federal cannabis laws, including by removing cannabis from the controlled substances list, regulating it, and pardoning federal cannabis-related offenses. While there's a lot of misinformation out there about cannabis and psychedelics, Congressman Blumenauer has been a rational voice for evidence-based legal reforms. And that's what POPLAR is about: educating, addressing misinformation, and supporting science-based psychedelics policies that promote equity and public health. So please join me in welcoming our guest, Congressman Earl Blumenauer.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mason, for the kind introduction and for the work that you are doing. I'm really excited to have this conversation today and the launch of projects on psychedelics law and regulation, the POPLAR Research Initiative. When you combine health, law, policy, biotechnology, and bioethics with the Harvard Law brand, this has the potential to have significant influence in this rapidly changing landscape. It's an area that I've been involved with throughout my public service, starting in the 70s with the decriminalization of cannabis in Oregon. And I've continued to work to provide leadership on drug policy reform. I've enjoyed working around the country from Bangor, Maine to Santa Barbara. Part of what gives me such hope is that this movement has not been driven by politicians. It is advocates, it's people in the industry, it's people who have been involved with aspects of medical cannabis for years. I think I was the only politician that was involved with our psilocybin ballot measure 109 and an equally significant ballot measure 110, where we have drug decriminalization and addiction treatment initiative. We're a pretty blue state, but for reference, that initiative passed by a wider margin than Joe Biden's victory in Oregon. We have powerful examples, particularly the impact of psilocybin that goes back decades with the federal government's involvement. It's going to be fun to unpack all of that federal government engagement. But we need more and better research, first and foremost. We need to move beyond the anecdotes that so many of us find compelling. And there are real life examples of people we know have experienced it, but it needs more scientific rigor. We need to fight the hypocrisy where the challenge psychedelics face as legitimate medical treatment face the old obstacles to research, despite being less addictive and having fewer health risks than other drugs freely available. Nicotine and alcohol, for instance. The contrast with opioids is stunning. That epidemic has killed thousands, damaged millions of lives, seemingly with few meaningful controls. As I mentioned, I think our advantage is that the American public is ahead of the legislature and other policymakers. They are demonstrating their interest and their support, not just according to public opinion polls, but that support is very powerful on the ground. It's just as advocates are demanding an end to the dated and racist approach, it's responding to broad public support as witnessed by those election results. Here in Oregon, the voters were very busy last year, not just with the psilocybin therapy, a measured and controlled approach, but the ballot measure that essentially decriminalized hard drugs and invested much more significant resources for drug treatment here in Oregon using the increased revenues from our marijuana legalization. The measure to pass the access to psilocybin established a framework, a law to allow for supervised administration of psilocybin-assisted therapy throughout the state. I think this is a major equity issue. One of the challenges we've had with our failed war on drugs and its misapplication is how it's negatively impacted minorities and marginalized groups. The pandemic has revealed health disparities. We know the disparities in terms of the application of the law. Our psilocybin therapy will allow access to communities historically denied full access to traditional forms of medicine. This is especially important for low-income communities of color, veterans, especially veterans who've tried and failed to receive relief, for example, of PTSD from other forms of treatment. Many Oregonians feel they could benefit from psilocybin-assisted therapy. It is an issue of equity. It's an issue of expanding the toolkit. It's expanding, responding to science and the public needs. I'm particularly interested in the potential to unlock revolutionary treatments on mood, anxiety, and substance abuse disorders. And this could not come at a more important time. The pandemic not only heightened the disparities in the treatment of healthcare, but it's had a dramatic impact on the mental and emotional health of Americans. Over 2 in 5 adults show symptoms of anxiety or depressive disorders. Here in Oregon, we've seen a major increase in overdose deaths. As we struggle to get through the COVID pandemic, we've got a mental health epidemic where it's clear our approaches have not been adequate. I hope our conversation today in the POPLAR Center will help us address critical issues, ensuring equitable access for marginalized communities, and as I mentioned, especially veterans. We want to provide robust funding for additional therapeutic research, and I look forward to suggestions for removing red tape and bureaucratic redundancies for drug development and therapy that has dogged us as we work to rationalize our cannabis policies. And I want to stress that I think it's very, very important to respect traditional and sacred use of psychedelics by Indigenous communities. Native Americans must not be an afterthought. They have much to teach us, and we have much to respect in that tradition, which has been so abused by the majority of American government. It's a tragic history. This is an important list of challenges, and I look forward to your conversation today, the work at the center, and for all of you helping us advance this cause. I promise you, I will do my part, not only assisting in the evolution of the Oregon program, but I plan on bringing this movement to Capitol Hill this year. The same way we developed a foundation for the support of our cannabis work, I want to introduce the results of our work in Oregon and around the country. And I would like your center to be able to help raise awareness on Capitol Hill at this critical time in drug reform to help the federal government catch up to where the rest of America is. I think this is truly the opportunity of a lifeline, and I look forward to working with you to make it a reality. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much, Congressman, for your powerful remarks and for your leadership. We're very grateful for you joining us today.
My pleasure.
We will now welcome our keynote speaker, Rick Doblin. He's the founder and executive director of MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. He founded MAPS in 1986, shortly after the Drug Enforcement Administration added the psychedelic MDMA to Schedule I of the Controlled Substances List. Since then, he's been a leading voice in the destigmatization of MDMA and other psychedelic therapies, working closely with the Food and Drug Administration to make MDMA-assisted therapy an FDA-approved treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder. And thanks to his efforts and others at MAPS, that's nearly a reality. Rick is a graduate of Harvard's Kennedy School, and so it's a pleasure to welcome him home virtually to discuss his important work. Welcome, Rick Doblin.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Congressman Blumenauer. It was very inspiring to hear your opening talk and to how you want to take this further. I'm going to share my screen, and let's start with a PowerPoint presentation. Take just a second to get there. There we go. Okay, so psychedelics, from legal to illegal to medicines to legal again.
We lost your slides, Rick. We had them for a second there.
Oh, you don't have them right now?
I can't. I just see a black screen.
Oh, okay. I see everything, and it was what we did before, but I can stop the share.
They were up for 1 second. I could see the screen.
All right, let me try to start it again then. Let's just see.
That's perfect.
Okay. Okay, great. Okay, I start the timer. Okay, so it's just so exciting to be here with you today and to have this topic being something that's being looked at in a careful way. So I'm going to talk about psychedelics from legal to illegal to medicines to legal again. Stan Grof has talked about psychedelics are to the study of the mind, what the microscope is to biology and the telescope is to astronomy. Stan is 90 years old now, the leading LSD researcher. And we all know that the telescope at a time was very controversial. Galileo died under house arrest. Father Bruno, who espoused the idea that the Earth wasn't the center of the universe, was burned at the stake by the church. So the telescope was extremely controversial and dangerous for people to look through. But now we just see it as a tool. And psychedelics are similarly tools, and they're not good or bad in and of themselves. It's how they're used. And so we hope that the psychedelics will be seen in this destigmatized way as really essential tools for understanding who we are as humans and to healing all sorts of different issues. This is the MAPS logo as interpreted by Alex Gray, an artist. The important thing here is that the hands are first, the humans, it's about therapy. The psychedelic background is background, and the human contact, the therapeutic use, is the foreground. And so what we're talking about is psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. This is a picture of Timothy Leary and me in 1990. This was a conversation at a MAPS benefit. And I had just asked him, with all of his advice and all of his experience, doing psychedelic research here at Harvard and also becoming a proponent, what advice did he have for me for trying to make psychedelics into medicines through the government? And his response was, fuck the government. I am so far past asking for permission for anything, but I'm glad you're doing it. And that's where he held up my hand. So I felt like this was not the passing the torch of cultural revolution, but passing the torch of sort of scientific research. And that was 1990. So if you look at this chart of the Web of Science, psychedelic publications, over about 70 years, what you'll see is a peak in the end of the 60s, early 70s, and that we all understand is the Psychedelic Revolution. And it was a major topic of scientific research. And the backlash happened, the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, and then things declined, scientific publications declined over the next several decades, and almost all those papers were just about the risks of psychedelics. And then it started climbing again after 1990, and that's when the group of people at the FDA who regulate psychedelics took over and switched to a new group who wanted to open the door to research, which they did in 1990 with Rick Strassman doing a DMT study, negatively focused on schizophrenia, maybe DMT, the only endogenous psychedelic, maybe too much of it caused schizophrenia. Then 1992, the FDA formally opened the door to psychedelic research. And you can see since then that that's rippled all over the world. And now we are really in the midst of the renaissance of psychedelic research. So this was just 2 years after Timothy Leary spoke to me there at the conference. Initially, this was all done by nonprofits. These are the sort of the main nonprofits. Then just a little bit around a year ago, the first IPO for a for-profit psychedelic came about. And now there's a handful of psychedelic nonprofits, but there's hundreds, we think over 400 for-profit psychedelic companies. This is just a list of some of them, many of them traded on the stock markets. And so I think there are really no fundamental regulatory obstacles at this point for doing psychedelic research, and no fundamental financial obstacles, as evidenced by all these for-profit companies. Since MAPS was founded in '86, we've raised over 130 million in donations and grants for psychedelic therapy and medical marijuana research. But in the last 2 years, the for-profits have raised about $1.5 billion. So that just gives you a sense of the scale of things. This is our corporate structure. MAPS is the nonprofit, which I started in April 1986. And the Public Benefit Corporation is our for-profit pharmaceutical arm, which we started December 2014. And this is sort of our virtuous circle. The Public Benefit Corporation is for-profit. We're trying to do two different things. One is bring back psychedelic-assisted therapy, but also market pharmaceuticals in a way that makes more sense than profit maximizing. And here what we do is we maximize public benefit. But the Public Benefit Corporation is 100% owned by the nonprofit. So people donate to MAPS, get a tax deduction, MAPS invests in the Public Benefit Corp. And then the Public Benefit Corp will do the research, will eventually sell MDMA, will make a profit. Profits will be used for the mission of the nonprofit. So that's where our currently, whether we can go forward in this way or whether we'll need to take in investors or so to globalize, to commercialize, to reach sustainability is not clear yet. But this is our current corporate structure. And this is an important regulation that was passed actually in 1984 called data exclusivity. And just to say what this is it's different than a patent. And I think one of the problems we're seeing is overbroad patents in psychedelics, but that's pro forma for pharma industry, but we wish it wouldn't be happening here. But data exclusivity provides incentives for developing drugs that are off patent. And that means that no one can use your data for a period of 5 years. If you do pediatric studies, you get an extra 6 months, and the FDA is requiring us to do pediatric studies. And then it blocks the generic competitor from applying for 5.5 years, and then it takes FDA at least 6 months to review. So there's this period of data exclusivity to provide incentives for developing drugs like psilocybin, like MDMA, like ibogaine, where the drugs themselves are in the public domain. I didn't know about this till 2013. It's very obscure because pharma companies don't develop drugs that they don't have patents on. So this data exclusivity is almost never used, but it is a law, and it is providing us the opportunity to tell donors, if you help us make MDMA into a medicine, then we can become a self-sustaining organization. And data exclusivity in Europe is 10 years. actually, 8 years data exclusivity, 2 years market exclusivity. Now, our public benefit model, first off, going around the clock, we maximize therapeutic outcomes for each patient, not profit. We share our findings. We're not creating patents. We create an ethical practice model for the for-profit. So we're sympathetic with for-profit. We're supportive, but we want to kind of keep them in check. And we see the for-profit motive in our healthcare system is warped it beyond all sense. We are very sympathetic with drug policy reform, and that's where I think we're different than a lot of for-profit companies. And I think what they do is they misunderstand their business model. They think that if people have legal access to psychedelics, either through the Oregon Psilocybin Initiative or just through decriminalization or eventually legalization, that will be bad for their business model, especially if we introduce harm reduction, psychedelic peer support, honest drug education, pure drugs, to educate the people to be sort of both psychedelic informed about how to handle it. I think it's actually going to create more people who want to go to psychedelic clinics with trained professionals covered by insurance. But I think there is this concern among the for-profits that either it's bad for the business model or that they should stay away from the controversy. But I think it's a moral imperative to see the counterproductive nature of the drug war and to work on drug policy reform. We also, obviously, within that context, support the use not just for medical purposes, but for personal and spiritual growth, and also addressing conflict between couples, so couples therapy, and cultures. We have a project where Israelis and Palestinians are using ayahuasca and MDMA together, and we're trying to study that as a model for psychedelics for group conflict resolution. So this is our public benefit model. Just give you a sense, Sarko is a police officer from outside Boston. He's a psychotherapist, and he's been given permission by his chief to go through our training program to learn how to give MDMA-assisted therapy to other police officers with PTSD. This was my TED Talk. The NSA is advertising on my TED Talk. So we've reached a place of cultural acceptance, and we're about to start research inside the Veterans Administration. I've been trying since 1990 to offer money to the VA to do MDMA PTSD research, and it's finally starting to happen at the Loma Linda VA sometime this month. And then shortly after, Rachel Yehuda at the Bronx VA is going to test 2 versus 3 sessions. Again, these are all funded by philanthropy, but they are taking place, and it's a major turning point. So there's no obstacles anymore working at the VA. We've yet to enroll any active duty soldiers. That's what we're hoping to do soon. That's, again, not a matter of regulation. We're going to start group therapy at the Portland VA early next year. So we feel just very optimistic about the way things are going. Now, in terms of regulations, we've had a formal dispute resolution that cost us over $250,000 of legal fees and many, many months with the FDA. But the FDA, we have a protocol to give MDMA to therapists as part of their training. And the FDA we have one that we're working on. We submitted a modified one December 2019, and FDA put a clinical hold on it. And they said, no, too risky. There's no benefits from giving MDMA to therapists as part of their training. We're never going to give you permission for this. Give it up. Try something else to train them. Also, they wanted the lead facilitator of our 2-person therapy team to be an MD or a PhD. Right now, they just have to be a licensed therapist. The second person doesn't need to have a license, but they wanted to insist that they have a bachelor's degree or 1,000 hours of behavioral health experience or in a program to get a license. And then they wanted there to be a physician on site for every psychedelic clinic, every psychedelic administration, where even for phase 3, we don't have that. We have a physician doing prescribing, screening, and on call, but not on site. So these are poison pills. It took us a lot of therapists or local small private practice therapists, they couldn't afford a doctor on site. So we went through a major process of this formal dispute resolution, and we appealed the Division of Psychiatry's views up to the Office of Neuroscience. And the Office of Neuroscience completely agreed with us. The clinical hold is removed. The lead person just needs to be a licensed therapist, and the physician does not need to be on site. So this was regulation, not a law, but it was something that, again, the FDA is designed to permit these disputes to go to higher levels, which was terrific. And it's important to challenge the FDA because they're nervous about approving stuff like this that's new and then getting blamed if anything goes wrong. So as far as our phase 3 results, just again, we've been permitted to move to phase 3, final stage of research. Our first study was published May 10th in Nature Medicine. The results were outstanding. We had 2 New York Times articles, Psychedelic Drug Passes Big Test, Psychedelic Revolution is coming. This was on the front page of the New York Times. Scientific American, MDMA shows new promise for trauma, but the drug alone is not a cure. That's really the key point we're trying to make, and I'm glad that's getting across. It's not the drug, it's the therapy, and the drug makes it. So what were the results? We had a very small p-value probability, meaning 1 in 10,000 chance that our results, the difference between the groups, was due to a random factor rather than to the MDMA-assisted therapy. We had a very large effect size. Effect sizes are on the basis of 1, meaning 1 standard deviation. So the placebo-subtracted effect size, where basically our placebo is therapy with inactive placebo versus therapy with MDMA. So the effect size of MDMA is 0.91, which is very large. The effect sizes for Zoloft and Paxil, which are approved for PTSD, the only drugs, are either some of their studies failed, or they were small effect sizes, or on the very low end of medium. But we're high, and then very high. 2.1 effect size is the within subjects when you combine MDMA with therapy. It's enormous. We replicated results from phase 2. No site-to-site variability. It wasn't driven by some great therapists at a certain site. And we had an excellent safety profile, no increase in suicidality in the MDMA group. We did have 2 people attempt suicide. 1 person attempted suicide twice during the study, and 1 person had such severe suicidal ideation that she checked herself into a hospital to avoid killing herself. Both were in the placebo group. So we met all the criteria for FDA to approve a drug on the basis of 1 phase 3 study instead of 2. Now, at the same time, a very similar time, FDA approves this Alzheimer's drug, and it's turned into a big scandal for FDA. They had failed phase 3 studies. They reinterpreted the data. It was marginal effect. It had significant safety problems, and yet it got approved. And we were rejected by the FDA on going forward with just 1 phase 3 study, even though we met all the criteria. So there is this concern about the controversy, the stigma of psychedelics. There's a concern about FDA regulators not wanting to be criticized if something goes wrong. But again, this is not a matter of law. It's just these are judgment calls that the FDA made. And so we are going to have to go through to the 2nd phase 3 study. This is a complicated slide, but just to show that the upper is the studies that we require for the NDA, which is new drug approval. And so we anticipate the 2nd phase 3 study in May of 2022. We'll get the interim analysis, an early read how it's doing, and then it'll be done in October of 2022. And then we analyze the data. If it's good, we submit it to FDA, and then we think by the end of the 3rd quarter, FDA will approve, and now DEA will reschedule 90 days later. Now, that used to be a problem. DEA would delay and delay and delay, and there was no way to force them. But Congress rectified that a bunch of years ago, and they passed a law that said that DEA must reschedule within 90 days. They didn't say which schedule it goes in, but DEA and the FDA Office of Controlled Substances Act work on that together. But DEA must reschedule. So this was a key regulatory problem, that regulation, that law has changed. So now we can say for sure that DEA must reschedule within 90 days. Now, states have to reschedule as well, and we will have a lot of work. 25 states automatically reschedule, and the others you have to do various things with their Department of Public Health, or whatever they call it, commissioners of public health or board of pharmacies. So there will be a bunch of work once DEA and FDA approve and reschedule. Then we have a lot of work to do on the states, and we hope it'll end up being in Schedule 3 or Schedule 4. I think that's likely. This is another matter of regulation. How is it going to be regulated post-approval? So it's called the Risk Evaluation and Mitigation Strategies, the REMS. It's only prescribed by prescribers certified in the REMS program, means special education for prescribers. It's only going to be 2 to 4 hours about the health risks of MDMA. But the therapists who administer it only can be those that have been through our training program, or our training program that we've licensed to schools of psychiatry and psychotherapy that has the content that we agree with. So only trained therapists and only special prescribers, and it's only shipped to the prescribers. It's never given to the patient. So it's not a take-home drug. It's only to be administered under direct supervision, and there's certain kind of safety screenings that are required. So under this kind of a situation, it's easy for the DEA to say that there's not going to be much drug diversion. Patients never get it to take home. It's only under supervision and it's only trained people. So I think that this is what we're going to negotiate with the FDA. Again, this is a matter of regulation, not law. There will be these psychotherapy clinics. There'll be eventually, I think, over 6,000 of them in America. There's already over 1,000 ketamine clinics, so we hear. And also, these clinics, people are going to want to cross-train. The therapists want to be cross-trained in MDMA, psilocybin, ketamine, and whatever else gets approved. It's not going to be like, here's an MDMA clinic, here's a psilocybin clinic. So I think this is what it's going to look like. This is our goal for during this period of data exclusivity to deliver 1 million MDMA sessions. And we think it'll be on average, maybe a 2-session model, 500,000 patients. And the bottom line here is the number of therapists that we need to train. And that's 25,000 therapists we're planning to train in the rest of the decade. And these numbers do not include group therapy, where that could dramatically increase what we're doing. And the tan line at the top is the therapist capacity. We're just assuming that they only work with psychedelics part of the time rather than all of the time. So they could potentially do more, and also we could do more with group therapy. But there's 8 or 9 million people with PTSD in America. So this is really only scratching the surface of the people that need the help. But we do think it should only be used by trained therapists. One of the biggest issues is going to be, how do we fully train therapists? And the issue there is, we think that therapists should have the legal opportunity to get the drug that they're going to give to patients, taking it themselves as a patient in a therapeutic setting. And how do we do that? We cannot knowingly sell as a sponsor for off-label uses. So MDMA for PTSD doesn't inherently include giving MDMA to therapists as part of their training. And I said we have protocols, but they're very expensive. We have to do all sorts of data gathering. So what we're going to do is propose for the FDA label, that the label will say MDMA for PTSD by trained therapists whose training can include 1 MDMA session. And if the FDA agrees to that, then that means that training therapists is on label, and then we can do that without a protocol. And that's what I think we really need to do. You wouldn't go to a meditation teacher that didn't meditate, a yoga teacher that never did yoga. It makes sense for therapists who want to volunteer. We're never going to make this compulsory. It's always going to be voluntary. We don't think that every therapist who's done MDMA is better than every therapist who hasn't. It's just each therapist would be more effective themselves if they have the experience with the drug that they're going to give to people. So this is how we approach it. Again, it's a matter of regulation. This is a really key important argument. Legalization follows medicalization. So this is a chart over almost more than 40 years about the American voter views, a Gallup chart on legalizing marijuana. Now the bottom is against the top, or the bottom is for, the top is against, and you can see it crosses over around 2013, where you get more than 50% are in favor of legalizing marijuana. Now, notice here that there's a rise from the very beginning in '69 through the '70s. This is when Jimmy Carter is elected in '76 on a platform of decriminalizing marijuana. But then you get the backlash, the parents' movements. Then you get Ronald Reagan just say no, starting in 1980. And support basically plateaus for several decades. And it only starts rising again around 1997. And what happened then? California and Arizona passed the first medical marijuana laws. So the rise of medical marijuana tracks the rise in support for marijuana legalization. And I think that you get people believing or not sure what to believe about all this propaganda from how terrible marijuana is. Not to say that it doesn't have risks, which it does. But I think medical use gives people access to stories of people that it's helpful for. It changes their risk-benefit analysis, and also you see distribution models, the medical marijuana clinics that aren't surrounded by people with machine guns. It's not underground, and then you're making tax money. So this is our history for marijuana. I think it'll be similar with MDMA. What we see here is, Denver made mushrooms the lowest priority. They were the first one to do it, the lowest enforcement. Oakland followed, Oregon psilocybin initiative, so that we're seeing these things spread across America. Then also Oregon decriminalizes all drugs, DC decriminalizes psychedelics. And we are now, MAPS is doing psychedelic harm reduction as part of our mission to make drug policy reform work. So we are consulting with and have a training program for police in Denver about what to do if they see somebody having a difficult psychedelic experience. And we're going to do a pilot of about 100. If that works, we're going to sign a contract to do around 3,000 first responders in Denver. And we hope to do that in Oregon and elsewhere to really build in our first responders an understanding of a better way to respond. So we've been doing this at festivals all over the world, particularly Burning Man and Boom Festival, and we're developing this public health framework for a post-prohibition future. It's just a nice little slide. We've done it at these festivals, but we're also trying to, as I say, do it with the Denver police and others. The way that we're thinking that this will work is that there will be licensed legalization. This is the long-term goal, that people have a license to do drugs. And the thing is that if you misbehave, your license is taken away and you get punished for your misbehavior. You don't get punished for your state of consciousness. It's your behavior, it's your performance. And the reason why I'm talking about this is that drunk drivers can lose their driver's license, but they easily can go to a bar and buy more alcohol, get in their car and kill people. We need to make it harder for people to, if they're drunk drivers, harder for them to get alcohol too. So I think we regulate alcohol too lightly. This is the program that we're talking about in the future for licensed legalization. We think it's going to require a decade of these psychedelic clinics being rolled out for people to hear these stories from people with positive experiences, and also to see psychedelic clinics, again, emerging from the underground. And that will change people's mind. We'll have licensed legalization, I think, in 2035. Now, how do we handle kids? For alcohol, 23 states where alcohol is prohibited to minors have an override for parents, where parents can give alcohol to their kids. And I think that's the way it should be with psychedelics, that there should be a parental override. And if you look at the cultures that have successfully integrated psychedelics, like the Navajo Native Americans that Congressman Blumenauer mentioned, or the ayahuasca churches, they don't have these age limits. So we're the parents, we are the family values, and we think that this decision should be made by the families rather than by the government. Edgar Mitchell, the astronaut, said, when we see our fundamental unity with the processes of nature and the functioning of the universe, as I so vividly saw it from the Apollo spacecraft, the old ways of thinking and behaving would disappear. So this fundamental unity is what people can experience through psychedelics, and I think that will have profound political implications once we realize our intimate connection to nature, to global warming, to the environment, to other species, to other people who look differently than us or have different religions, different races, different gender orientations. I think this fundamental unity, psychedelics will help people experience this. This is why we need mass mental health as our goal. We need drug policy reform, and we also need drug development. It's a lot easier to work with psychedelics than shoot everybody up in space. So this is the political theory behind what we're trying to say, is the more people we can help experience this fundamental unity, the better off we'll be. And then we hope 2070 Psychedelic Utopia, this was, that we'll have a more spiritualized world. Right now, we're humans as a group, lemmings going over the cliff. What we're doing with the environment and warfare and prejudice and authoritarianism. So this is our sort of idealistic plan. Now, how did this begin? Just to say, MDMA was invented in 1912. It was rediscovered by Sasha Shulgin. It was introduced into therapy by Leo Zeff, the secret chief. It leaked out of this to become ecstasy, and that's what attracted the government's attention. They started criminalizing. This is me in the background going in to ask for a hearing in 1984. We won the hearing. The judge said MDMA should be a Schedule III drug, but the DEA rejected the recommendation. They criminalized MDMA on an emergency basis while the hearing was still going on. That was illegal. They didn't have the authority to do that. People got busted for the first year, got released. And then I started MAPS. And I realized the only way was going to be nonprofit drug development through the FDA. And our first protocols from Harvard, from elsewhere, were all rejected. And then it was 1992 that Charlie Grove and I got permission for the first phase 1 dose response safety study. This now points to the FDA again as being the key factor. And it wasn't regulation, it wasn't laws, it was people interpreted differently the data that they saw at the FDA, and they decided to let the research go forward. This is a psychedelic slide prepared by the FDA, just to indicate again that they're fully behind this. But we don't have federal funding. So the Texas legislature has allocated $1.5 million to the Houston VA to study psilocybin. And we're working with them now to allocate another 1.4 million or 1.5 million for an MDMA arm to compare with psilocybin. So we'll know in the next month or so if they allocate that money. Dan Crenshaw, this is bipartisan support. He's a Republican congressman from Texas, from Houston, former Navy SEAL. He's our main ally. He's heard from so many Navy SEALs who've gotten help from psychedelics. He put this amendment to the Defense Appropriations Act to help the DoD do this. It didn't get attached, but it's starting to show that we're doing some work. This is where we need help, federal funding. Matt Johnson just announced at Hopkins that for the first time in over half a century, NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, has given a grant of $4 million over 3 years to study psilocybin for smoking cessation. So finally, NIDA is getting over its prejudices against saying anything good about illegal drugs. Now, the last thing that has been really bad about regulations and potentially, legal obstruction of Schedule I research was with marijuana. And it was through the NIDA monopoly, which has been existent since 1968. There's only been one source of marijuana for FDA-regulated research, but it's only for research, not for commercial use. And so therefore, in phase 3 FDA studies, you have to use the exact same drug that would be commercialized. And since you can't commercialize NIDA marijuana, this is how we blocked, how the DEA blocked marijuana from becoming a medicine. Now, by the FDA, we have all these states, but they've done that as a reaction in part against the fact that the federal system was blocked. NIDA also provides terrible quality marijuana, the oldest, the driest, it's really bad. I've been involved with lawsuits against the DEA trying to break this monopoly since 2000. We finally got into court in 2005. Again, we won the case, and the DEA once again rejected the recommendation and kept the NIDA monopoly. But that just ended a few months ago. The DEA finally is going to license other people to grow marijuana so that there can be drug development in the United States with domestic product. And you can see the contrast we're trying to make between good quality marijuana and what NIDA provides. And also, we just got $12.9 million from the state of Michigan for a study of cannabis in veterans with PTSD, and 320 veterans. So we're getting state funding, not federal funding. Now that this monopoly has ended, there are really no fundamental political obstructions to research with psychedelics or marijuana. And as closing, I'll just say that this is going to be another area of research or regulatory that we'll have to deal with is direct-to-consumer ads. So this we've kind of created as a fun thing. Ask your doctor if MDMA therapy is right for you. How do we handle really direct-to-consumer ads? All sorts of issues related to that. And so I just want to say that it's been a real pleasure to be able to give this big overview to all of you, and also to say that I feel that we are in an incredible moment of opportunity, of great need, and open doors at the regulatory agencies, not just in the US, but around the world. And I think if we're very careful and very thoughtful and do a lot of public education, a lot of pre-thought about laws and regulations, that we will be able to mainstream psychedelics and potentially have a big impact on the mass mental health. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was such an interesting, incredibly rich presentation. And we have a number of questions. I just want to ask you one that I think is really important. This comes from Brendan Aronson. How can entrepreneurs and advocates help veterans gain access to this medicine? Are there any unmet needs right now? How can people help?
Well, for example, we need outside funding. The VA is not yet at the point where they're willing to fund it. So we've got the Texas state legislature. If there are entrepreneurs in Texas, they can work now with the Texas legislature, with their representatives, to try to get them to allocate this 1.4 million to do an MDMA comparison to psilocybin. Also, wherever you happen to be located, contact your local VA and suggest that they get involved in this. There's a program called a program of therapy, cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy, which is conjoint as couples or dyads, where one has PTSD and the other is impacted, the partner is impacted. And we've done a small treatment development study where both of them get MDMA. And the results were better than anything with cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy without MDMA. And it's an accepted evidence-based treatment used throughout the VA. So we're trying to raise $2 million to start studies inside the VA. So right now, entrepreneurs can engage the VA, they can donate to MAPS to help us do this, contact their representatives, and just say that we really need this. But I'd say that the critical thing is moving us into the Department of Defense, to active duty soldiers, on the theme of treating people closer to the trauma. The closer to the trauma, the easier it is. And that's the same idea of doing pediatric studies. So the FDA has said, if we succeed in adults, we have to study 12 to 17-year-olds. So I think we need help to really get approval from people in the DoD to let active duty soldiers with PTSD go through our treatment.
Thanks again for joining us. It's really been a pleasure having you. And thanks also to Congressman Blumenauer. And this is a good note on which to transition into our first panel, the topic of which is psychedelics advocacy and expertise. So I'm going to hand it over to Professor Dustin Marlin, my colleague at the University of Massachusetts School of Law. Dustin, welcome.
Thanks, Mason. And what a treat to hear Rick Doblin speak. Fantastic. So I'm Dustin Marlin, and I'm thrilled to be moderating this panel on psychedelic advocacy and expertise on behalf of the launch of POPLAR. We have 4 expert panelists with us today: Angela Carter, Bia Labachi, Ismail Ali, and Rachel Yehuda. I'm very much looking forward to this discussion. Panelists, to start, could you briefly, in just a minute or two, introduce yourselves and describe your background as relevant to these issues? And let's go with alphabetical order by your first names.
So I suppose that is me? Oh, no, Angela.
That might be Angela.
I would love to start my video, but I'm told by Zoom that it won't let me. So there we go. All right. Hey folks. Hello. All right. So I'm sorry, in my attempt to figure out the camera, I did not hear the question. Would you be willing to repeat it?
Certainly, if you could just briefly introduce yourself and describe your background as relevant to these issues.
Of course. My name is Angela Carter. I use they, them pronouns. I live in Portland, Oregon. So good morning to all of you on the West Coast and good afternoon to the East. I am a white, queer, transgender, and intersex naturopathic physician. I am a member of the Oregon Psilocybin Advisory Board, as well as the co-vice chair, and I also chair the equity and training subcommittees. I have been volunteering with Fireside Project, which is the psychedelic support line, since March of this year, I believe. I've worked as a medic at Burning Man for emergency services there for the last 10 years, supported a lot of people through psychedelic experiences there. I also work with Queerdome, which is the queer and trans focused parallel to Zendo at Burning Man. And I will leave off there and leave room for someone else to go.
Hello,
Thanks.
everybody. Oh.
Go ahead, Bia, sorry.
Hello, everybody. Greetings from the Bay Area, Ohlone Territory. My name is Beatriz Labachi, but I like to use my nickname, which is Bia. And I am Brazilian. I'm also queer. And I'm a recent immigrant to the United States. Been living here for 4 years. Just got my American citizenship. Yay. It's a pleasure to be here, and sounds very impressive. Washington and Congressman and Harvard. I feel a lot of excitement that I have the chance in my lifetime to see the revolution moving forward and the walls of prohibition slowly starting to crack down, and some fresh of breathe air coming to the, you know, to us, to alleviate our suffering that has been the drug war and the persecution of Black and brown communities, and incarceration of people, and ignorance and stupidity and taboo and stigma. Finally, hearing this congressman almost cried. So yeah, I just wanted to say that I feel we are in the cusp of history, and it's very important and, you know, awesome to be here. I have a job at MAPS together with Rick. I'm also executive director of the Chacruna Institute for Psychedelic Plant Medicines. And I have a job at CIIS where I'm adjunct faculty. Yeah, 3 underpaid job. No, I mean, it's very nice working on different hats on the psychedelic front, and happy to be here. Thanks.
I think I'm next. Thank you so much, Mason and Dustin, for the invitation and for holding this panel and this conversation. And Angela and Bia have said, also super excited to be here, especially with the three of you, with Angela, Bia, and with you, Rachel. My name is Ismail Lodido Ali. I'm based also in California in the Bay Area. I wear many hats like so many of us, but I spend most of my time working as policy director at the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, also with Bia and with Rick, focusing primarily on kind of the intersection of law, policy, advocacy, culture, and how those things all fit together, and how, as Bia kind of implied, we start to chip away at the walls of prohibition, but recognizing that we're also in a time where we're not just trying to end the war on drugs, but we're also trying to create something new. So really glad to be part of this conversation. I also work with Chacruna and a few other organizations in the space, and just glad to be here, glad to be in this conversation.
Hi, I'm Rachel Yehuda, and I am a straight, white, conventional academic. I've been a professor at Mount Sinai School of Medicine for the last 30 years, and I've also been at the Bronx VA for that long as well. And my interest in psychedelics is rather recent. I have a longstanding interest in post-traumatic stress disorder, and we've recently established a center for studying the effects of psychedelic psychotherapy. And really, this is about as mainstream academic an endeavor as it probably gets in the psychedelic world. But I think that, as you heard from Rick, the idea of getting into the VA and in traditional mainstream medicine is very, very important. And so that's what we're going to try to produce, the science and the clinical trial results that will help with that. Also really grateful to be here.
Thank you all for those excellent introductions. So I'm going to pose a series of questions to the panelists. Not all of the panelists need to answer each question necessarily, but I do want to give you all an opportunity if you want to answer the question. So please use the hand raising feature on Zoom if you're familiar, or you can simply do it physically. But my first question is, how would you define the term psychedelic?
I can jump in for that. I think that the term it's evolved a lot over the last 50, 60 years. And I think that there's sort of a Western culture definition of what psychedelics are. And then there's a lot of other cultural definitions, and we often forget those and leave those out. From a Western conceptualization, they're substances that interact with 5-HT2A serotonin receptors, and they create changes in perception and expand reality and facilitate both literal and figurative connections in the brain and in the mind. This is a little bit of a limited view, though. It really only focuses on the individual And in a lot of cultures with a long history of use of psychedelics, the individual can't be really disconnected from the community of humans, other animals, their environment, non-corporeal energies. So the use of psychedelics in these contexts is more of a concept of facilitating a healing journey in the relationships between individuals and the communities that surround them and include them. And that the communities heal alongside the person who is receiving the medicine.
Thanks so much, Angela. Rachel.
I think that you've asked a really great question, and I think that we don't have a consensus definition of what a psychedelic is, and we need to have one. And that might require convening a group of people to really hash out what is a psychedelic, much as they did a few years ago when the term epigenetics was not precisely defined. People get together and come up with a consensus, because the issue here is how much of the definition is really about the chemical compound, the chemistry, the pharmacology, and the mechanism of action versus the subjective effects. And I think there's a real tension in having, in not really knowing how to approach this from a definitional perspective. Right now, we're kind of defining psychedelics like we define art. I know it when I see it, right? But I think that for the field to really expand, particularly in terms of scientific knowledge, there should be some attempt to really come up with at least different options of what can and can't be considered a psychedelic, and is it based on objective, subjective properties, or both?
Thanks, Rachel. So I'm not seeing any other hands there. So why don't we move on to the next question, which is, can psychedelics help to alleviate the mental health crisis? And along those lines, what would you say to someone who says the answer to our mental health and drug problems is not more drugs? Ismail.
Yeah, I can touch a little bit on this. In the same way, first off, I really appreciated Angela and Rachel's responses, because I think it teased this question up well. And I think specifically what you said, Rachel, around, is this a chemical question, or is this an experiential question? Is this about phenomenon, or is this about biology? And I think that question actually helps inform this one. Because to say that psychedelics may have benefit to people's mental health, I think is one piece of the equation. And I think that the scientific evidence, the clinical trials, et cetera, are starting to show that possibility in a really clear way within the realm of that kind of scientific research framework. And I would also say that to reduce psychedelics only to mental health interventions is also missing, I think, part of what they are and can be. So I do think, in short, the answer is yes. I absolutely believe that psychedelics, when responsibly used and when done in a way that has the proper container, intention, and support and integration and so on, absolutely can have significant transformative beneficial effects for people's mental health experience, for diagnosed indications, and also for more complex and esoteric spiritual dilemmas. And also, I think reducing psychedelics merely to their healing or to their therapeutic effects also misses part of the point, because a big part of what I believe psychedelics offer is actually a method of meaning making. And I think one of the things that makes this harder to track, and people describe psychedelics, oh, they're hallucinogenic, they make you see things, or they make you reflect, or they make you introspective, or they can be a lot of different things. But at their core, I think one of the things that the psychedelic experience often offers people is an ability to derive meaning from experiences that they've had, and to build a narrative that allows them to then move forward in their lives in different ways. And that can cut in a lot of different directions. What kind of support they have, what kind of environment they're in, all those factors really matter in the meaning they create out of their experiences. But it's really that process of reflecting and understanding what is the context within which my experience is occurring that allows people to then draw from. Some of that happens in the psychedelic experience, but a lot of it doesn't. A lot of it's brought up in the psychedelic experience, but is integrated while people are in clear, sober, non-psychedelic states. And I think that interplay between the ecstatic or mystical or reflective state and their everyday, routine, mundane lives, that interplay, I think, is really where the meaning of the psychedelic experience and the psychedelic process really emerges.
Thanks, Rachel, and then Angela. You're on mute, Rachel.
Do it again.
The answer to your question, can psychedelics help to alleviate the mental health crisis, is just a categorical yes. And I think that's why it's so exciting. And it's more than that. I think that psychedelic assisted psychotherapy can help actually revolutionize how we deliver treatment to mental health patients. And that's really exciting about it too, because what we're doing now is pharmacologically suppressing symptoms with our treatments. We're trying to get people to just kind of adapt to the idea that they have a chronic mental health problem. We try to minimize risk, make sure we hold them close to us. And this is offering something really very, very different. And to those who say that the answer to our mental health and drug problems is not more drugs, the beauty of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy is that you only have to take the psychedelic a few times. And the idea isn't really that you're depending too much on the pharmacologic property of the drug in suppressing symptom, using the psychedelic as a tool to obtain better insight and understanding of what your mental health problems are about. This is a revolution, not just because we're taking a drug that is currently not legal and using it, but because it just changes the entire approach to what pharmacotherapy in mental health is all about.
Thanks. Go ahead, Angela.
Okay. So in response to the question, the answer to our mental health and drug problems is not more drugs. I would say, what are we doing already? We're giving people more and more and more drugs. They may be legal drugs, but they do significant harm. Some numbers for you. There was a 64% increase in people using antidepressants between 1999 and 2014. In 1999, there was 7.7% of the population taking some sort of antidepressants versus 12.7 back in 2017. And many more now, especially because of the pandemic and all of the distress that people are experiencing. And major depression has been surging. It was 6.1% in 96, and 2015 it was up to 10.4, higher now. Last year, more than 20 million antidepressants were prescribed between October and December, and that's a 60% increase compared to the same 3 months in 2019. Sorry if that might not be the right number. 6%. Sorry. So we're increasing the number of drugs that we are putting out. It's costing us billions of dollars and muting our emotions, and it's not really working. So psychedelics have the capacity to provide healing that is long-term, that is permanent, doesn't require a daily pill. And in regards to the mental health crisis, okay, who has the mental health issues? It's people who are traumatized. And who is traumatized? It's marginalized communities. And what comes with marginalization is poverty and a lack of social capital. And impoverished and marginalized people can't access services. I know that psychedelics could offer a huge amount of relief if they are provided in a low barrier, trauma informed and low cost manner. If we want to actually have an impact on the mental health crisis, we have to get these services covered by Medicaid, by insurance. we have to find a way for people to access them. My preference, honestly, would be to make them freely accessible. There's over 10% of people with severe mental health issues don't have insurance. And so I believe that it definitely could put a significant dent in the mental health crisis, but we have to think about who has the mental health crisis and how we're going to assure that they can access the services.
Beautifully stated, Angela. B, I saw your hand was up there for a second. Did you want to weigh in?
Well, I know there's a lot of questions, so I'm a little reluctant because some of the other ones are my favorites. But I think in one line that when you say, oh, how are you going to replace drugs with drugs? I'd say, okay, that's a fair question. But what about stopping and thinking along the lines of what my colleague said? What do you understand by drugs? So it's really about reconceptualizing the very idea of drugs and remembering the old definition from pharmacon, from ancient Greece, that, you know, it depends on everything depends on the doses. On certain quantities, something can be either a medicine or a poison. And so I think the important thing to retain is that these things are not substances in itself that have like little creatures that have this magical ability to dominate us and to enslave us or to heal us or to transform us, but they are substances to which we create a relationship. And it's in this relationship that also has a mediation of a group or therapist, a larger social cultural context, that certain outcomes happen. So it's not just about the substance per se, it's about the use. And different substances can be used positively or negatively. We all know that there are some people that go on coma using alcohol, and others, you know, can have a fairly reasonable relationship to heroin, non-addictive and integrated lifestyle. And it depends on how do you define the borders of the very notion of what is drug, what is food, what is habit, what is vice, what is addiction. Those are all things that have been constructed under this larger paradigms of prohibition, of a certain moralization of drugs, of the religious views that founded our understandings of what these substances are. And I just wanted to tell Rachel, it's a pleasure to meet you. I have edited papers of yours. And I'm not going to dispute the wide, straight academic professor, because I believe you on that. But when you say you are a conventional one, I wouldn't say you're so conventional, because studying drugs is not very conventional. And we all know that there's a lot of stigma. So I want to commend you for being a mainstream academic conservative institution and doing the work you do, because we do need a lot of more wide, straight, conventional women doing this work to advance this movement. And I want to, say that to you.
Ismail.
Yeah, I love this conversation, but I don't want it to move on to the next question without touching on something that I think is really important here, where I think everything that everyone here has said is true around the potential of psychedelic substances, like in the context of mental health. And also, I think one of the reasons I pull back on that response sometimes is because while they may work more, they may work in a way that's different from our current psychiatric interventions. I also don't think that ending the mental health crisis is a matter of healing people only. I think that it's actually, and Angela, you touched on this in your response, I think actually looking at social determinants of mental health is the only way we're going to end a mental health crisis. We can't, even if we have really effective healing tools, we won't heal ourselves out of a mental health crisis. The mental health crisis is a complex situation that is based on many underlying factors. So the only way to end it is actually to prevent it at the root, which is based on actually transforming the causes of trauma, whether that's social marginalization, whether that's war, whether that's racial discrimination, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I do think that there's something revolutionary about, psychedelics as an intervention in that way from the point of healing forward. But there's something that's underlying that does need to be touched on in order for true mental health revolution or shifts to occur in a macro scale.
Great. So for the next question, I want to touch on a slightly different topic. What problems, if any, do you see with the commercialization of psychedelics? And what alternatively might be the benefits to such commercialization? Let's go back to you, Ismail.
Okay, this is a big question. I'm sure we could all talk for an hour about it. A good friend told me some years ago that, especially in America, this is very true in like our kind of post-industrial era, commercialization merely means permission, commercialization or legalization, I should say, merely means permission to commodify. So I feel like when you're saying commercialization, you're kind of already jumping to the assumption that we've legalized and that there's some sort of regulated system for access. And to me, this is like the big dilemma, I think, of the process of legalizing substances, which is to say that we can agree, and I believe strongly that legal regulated access is safer for people, for users, for families, for society, than fully underground use and fully underground economic dynamics as they currently exist. However, I think that the risk of commercialization is very high because of the way commercial products have been incorporated into the market and the way especially advertising and manipulation of psychological states has been utilized in the modern era, especially through online targeted advertising. I do worry about the fact that every single one of the social media platforms that some of us use has a pretty thorough psychological profile on every user that they have. And I really worry about the way that that information can be manipulated to advertise to people. I do think that psychedelics can have tremendous benefit when used responsibly for a large number of people, but that benefit, I believe that there is a tension between that potential benefit and the incentives of commercial actors that are seeking profit, whether it's for the substances themselves, whether it's for the services or so on. So that's kind of a vague statement, but I do think that many of the risks or harms that come with the market in general, which include, limited information, what kind of education is out there, what kind of promotion is permitted, what claims are allowed to be made. Those are all questions that I think need to be very critically thought through as we move more toward a legal regulated system. I don't know if, fully regulating everything within the pharmaceutical framework is the right approach. I don't think that's it either. I think that's one answer out of many. I also don't think that a total free market, free-for-all approach where people can just use the Wild West of the internet data, big data world to target information to users is the right idea either. I feel like that figuring out how to bring psychedelics into a legal regulated framework also forces us to confront these other questions that are about commerce in general, about the internet in general, about how people have access in general. So the worries are many, and I think that it's imperative for this community, for this movement, for the center, for POPLAR to be thinking through like how will society actually integrate? What is the right pace of doing that, and how do we do that responsibly without leaving more vulnerable people? Because there are very many vulnerable and very desperate people who are seeking help. How do we do that without not just leaving them behind, but not saying, oh, the way we're not going to leave you behind is by selling you this new product that you really need? There's got to be something better than that.
Yeah, Bia.
Yeah, I think, the psychedelic movement is in a crucial peak at this time. And what's happening, unfortunately, there's all kinds of sharks that start to circulate around the pristine waters of our beautiful sacred plants and teaching medicines, and all sorts of capitalists and vulture capital and venture capital and all kinds of players, people that have no history in the field of psychedelics. And they're wondering, should I invest in Formula One or sports? No, maybe I'm gonna open a retreat center in Jamaica. Yeah, that should be more profitable. So yes, let's be real. There's a lot of opportunism and a lot of people that don't have any clue and don't understand the nature of psychedelics and have never tried psychedelics and don't have any connection to any communities. And I think we have to organize ourselves as communities to avoid happening to psychedelics what happened in the cannabis movement. And I think events like this and bringing the discussion to prestigious universities and with good academics and a balance of activists and harm reduction, public education, academic knowledge, public policy, health discussions is central to guide the ways that this movement is going to move forward. So in this way, I just really want to cherish the organization of such event, because by having these conversations, we're going to create awareness around the needs to move this in ways that feels good for everybody. Because if not all of us are free, none of us is. So the psychedelic movement has to be inclusive, has to be for all, has to be to take care of minorities, and make sure that everybody's special needs are tended to. We just launched a book called Psychedelic Justice. I recommend you all take a look. We're making a little bit this claim right now over there.
So if I could ask a more specific follow-up to the last question, which is, there's a growing concern that psychedelic knowledge is being taken from indigenous communities without either acknowledgement or compensation. How can this be remedied? In other words, where's the dividing line between learning ethically from the practices of indigenous cultures versus wrongful appropriation?
I just want to bring back to, I am a recent immigrant, and a lot of things I still feel that I'm watching the movies, or is this the United States? Or when I see a congressman of the United States of America opening a lecture in Harvard, talking about the importance of taking into account Native Americans' perspectives, I feel I'm in the right spot. We had an opening conversation here acknowledging this. So I think, this is on the table of discussions, and this is being brought, and I am thankful and grateful that this discussion is happening. Also, Angela is part of the Plant Medicine Healing Alliance. This initiative is bringing a lot to the forefront, indigenous concerns. Our modest institute, the Chacruna Institute for Psychedelic Plant Medicines. Chacruna is the catch-all word for the substance, one of the substances that make the leaf that makes ayahuasca. So we are a tribute to ayahuasca, the name of our nonprofit. I think where do you draw these lines is the million-dollar questions. Like, people like to say some cliches like, let's appreciate and not appropriate. Like, there is this kind of cliche phrase, and let's honor, but let's not appropriate. Like, how? It's a little bit more complicated, and exactly where do you draw the lines? It's a challenge. But I just want to say one thing. You want to help indigenous people, want to be supportive of indigenous people, make indigenous friends, talk to indigenous people, ask them questions, listen, create relationships. It's not an abstraction. Don't talk about the generalized acknowledgement of this generic indigenous person and celebrate this, traditional wisdom for millennia and of indigenous people since ever. But do you have an indigenous connection? And ask him his opinion. Are you sitting in circles with him? What do they think? Create those relationships, reach to people, trust, stop, listen, and a message to the psychedelic movement. There is a branch of our movement that is completely disrespectful to indigenous people. And I'm not talking here about scientists. I'm not talking about white, straight biomedical people. I'm talking about activists that have disregarded, disrespected, trashed, banalized, and vulgarized the authentic leadership of Native American church in this country. And that is really bad karma.
So I saw some other hands that went up and then went back down again. Does anybody else want to weigh in on this question?
Rachel, yours went up first. Would you like to jump in, or should I? Okay. These are all such good questions, and I really agree with everything Bia is saying. It's in some ways it's complex because it feels like there's all these competing needs and interests, and in some ways it's really not. And it's very clear that the way that psychedelics have been brought into the quote unquote mainstream reflects and is a mirror of the way that so many other substances and traditions and knowledges have been brought out of, extracted, stolen in so many ways from indigenous people throughout history. And so in some ways it feels like this like new sticky thing. How do we deal with reciprocity? How do we deal with appropriation? In some ways it's the same story that's been happening for hundreds of years. And I think that that's relevant because it means that we can in some ways look at the way that, you know, questions about biopiracy, questions about IP, traditional representation, traditional knowledge have been dealt with in other sectors and in other situations. We can see the failures and maybe the occasional successes of how that's been done before. And I think, like the question about commercialization, there is an open opportunity for how to be in right relation and be weaving our relationship among people from these variety of stakeholders, from indigenous people and otherwise, as things are brought forward. I think the hard thing about this is that many people I meet who are in this space who ask about reciprocity, you know, how do we be in right relation? They come from the kind of premise that as long as you spread the money around in the right way, we're good. And I think a lot of the issues can be boiled down to the assumption that financial gain is like the main or primary only question here. Are we appropriately spreading out the profits that exist? I think it's harder for people, especially enthusiastic new participants in the psychedelic ecosystem or industry or however, you know, whichever part they're in, to actually go even one step further and say, oh, should we even be doing this in the first place? And I think that, like, should we be doing this in the first place question is the harder one, because it touches on a lot of these bigger cultural concerns around ownership, around traditional use, and so on. So having my answer to this is really, especially when it comes to reciprocity, a lot of it depends on where someone is situated, what are the levers of power, influence, or access that you have as an individual. It's really hard to kind of try to put together a one-size-fits-all approach on the individual level. I think on the government level, you have clear asks, land back, you know, healthcare, health support. Like, there's big picture asks that are clearly being articulated by Native American and Indigenous people here and around the world around sovereignty, about protection from development, from mining, from clear cutting, from land destruction. And then when you bring that closer into this question about psychedelics and this knowledge in particular, it's helpful, I think, to see that in context of a much larger arc of genocide and cultural destruction that's occurred for hundreds of years. And then when you put those things in context, suddenly the question isn't, oh, how do we make sure that we develop this indigenous drug in the right way through this particular framework, but it's who are the people that are the reason I have this knowledge as a person who's suddenly able to leverage all these resources toward creating a new product or engaging in a new industry. And how do me as that individual with those levers of power, with those levels of influence, how do I do that in a way that's really right? And like Bia said, part of that is actually being in actual relationship with people who are involved in this, and to not fall into this kind of trap of the noble savage story, like, oh, we respect indigenous people and their traditions, but we're just going to like do this thing and then we'll give 5% of our thing back, you know? So I think that there's something to be said for the way that corporate social responsibility has flattened what actual responsible intercultural experience can be. And because of all the incentives and perils of the market, it's hard to kind of sift through what the proper motivations are, what the right approach is. So that was a lot of words and it wasn't very specific, but I think that it's important to recognize that so much of this question is bound up in what is actually going on for a person and in their experience. And then what's their system of accountability to the people that they're in relationship with, and how do they hold that throughout?
Fantastic. Anyone else want to speak on this question before we would move to a different question? Okay, so the next question is a bit more metaphysical. The question is, can psychedelics provide insights into the fundamental nature of reality, or rather just into our own minds? And does it matter?
What do you think, Dustin?
Depends on what part of me is answering the question.
Very psychedelic answer. I like it.
Here's a hand, Rachel.
Yeah, I mean, we're just shifting the conversation a lot. We started out in mental health, and now we're in indigenous cultures and cultural appropriation and the nature of reality and psychedelics. And I think that one of the really big challenges in this psychedelic renaissance is that there really is a very big distinction about I'll use the word appropriating, but appropriating psychedelic strategies for use as mental health treatments and other uses of psychedelics, whether it be ceremonial or mystical or, for people that aren't necessarily trying to heal from a specific mental health condition, but just want to have a deeper kind of experience and connection with the universe. So I think it's very hard to not keep those things separate because the considerations are very different. So for example, back to the former question, which I didn't really know how to articulate that well, I think you can learn so much out of having the experience of taking a psychedelic in the context of ceremony, especially if you're having the respect to the indigenous culture that provided the experience. If you're not part of that culture, how do they feel about you being there? I don't know, but you can learn a lot about how psychedelics are used and then take some of that knowledge, but it's not all going to be directly relevant to how to apply psychedelic assisted psychotherapy in kind of traditional clinical situations. And particularly, what Angela was talking about earlier about making them widely available, understanding marginalized people or the kind of people that require that develop mental health conditions and the determinants of those things. There's a part of me that wants us to be really careful and regulated and not medicalized so much, but just ultra responsible about how psychedelics are administered, especially to vulnerable people. And this other part that understands that for many, many people, psychedelics aren't medicines for a specific condition, but just agents for healing and spiritual growth and connection. I think it's just very challenging, especially as a scientist trying to really wrap my head around how to study these phenomena, how to really advocate the most responsible use of psychedelics, which I think is predicated on scientific discovery, on really trying to understand also for whom psychedelics might not be helpful, might be potentially harmful, or the contexts under which psychedelic use might be harmful. I think that it's really hard to have all these conversations at once, and we kind of do want to keep them a little bit separate.
So let me ask a follow-up to the last question that's a little bit less abstract. And that is there a tension between rational psychedelic science and the spiritual nature of the psychedelic experience? Ismail.
Yeah, this is a good big question. And Rachel, I think you teed it up really well, right? Because so much of the way that the current conversation around psychedelics has been brought forward, especially in kind of mainstream society, is so like on the heels of and in the wake of all of this scientific research that's been coming out. And I think that there's a tension there, which actually touches on the last question, which is, to whom, to which authorities are we appealing? To which authorities are we asking or trying to get the right information from? And so I think to answer your question, Dustin, the context and the audience really matters. I think one of the things that psychedelics offer, in addition to meaning making, like I had mentioned earlier, is the possibility of experiencing a non-binary or non-dual experience. And I think that's really important, not just in like a heady esoteric way, but actually to even directly answer your question, that the fact is that right now, legally speaking, theoretically, or I should say legally speaking and societally, we treat like the scientific, materialistic research, rationalist research in one category, when we treat the spiritual, mystical experience in a different one. And if there's anything that I've learned working with psychedelics professionally and personally for, well over a decade, it's that the belief that there is a strong firewall between the mental healthcare, medicine, and our spiritual health is not as clear, I think, as many want it to be. And I think even legally speaking in the United States, where you have really clear distinctions of this is religious spiritual use and this is medical use, and there's definitely nothing in between, I think is a bit of a betrayal of what's actually going on. And I think one of the things that psychedelics are offering as they come into the medical mainstream, as well as they become more visible because of their kind of spiritual capacity, is that those lines are a little bit more blurred than people want. And that, Rachel is an expert on epigenetics, which is, I think, is another field, maybe where you see some of this blending of like, how much of this is genetic, how much of this is environmental, how much of this is something else. And I think it's actually an opportunity for medicine and spirituality to both be in dialogue, to both be in a place where those things can be a little bit clearer to our puny human minds.
So let's hear from Angela and then Rachel.
So, yes, there is definitely a tension there, and I think it's in part because Western science is a spirituality for many people. It is a foundational spiritual belief in order and rationality. There's this desire to categorize and simplify, to take a story and turn it into a narrative and then codify the pieces, and to try and make the ineffable into words. That is a big desire in Western science religion. But at the base of it, psychedelics don't care what degree you may have, what knowledge may be in your head, how you have divided things up. Your ego, as full of knowledge as it may be, is going to dissolve in the face of psychedelics. And so I think that the tension is in the blinders, in this is the way it is, this is the way it's done. The Western paradigm of rationality. I see a lot of room for expansion and growth of the Western scientific culture because of and through psychedelics. I hope that psychedelic science will bring to the larger field of Western science more of that curiosity, that openness, and that willingness to be present with things that you don't know. Yeah, I'll leave it off there.
Bia.
Yes, of course there is this tension. And if you go to MAPS conferences, and I want to put a plug, get ready, fasten your seatbelts, Denver Psychedelic Science, Denver Psychedelic City 2023, June. MAPS is planning the biggest psychedelic conference on the history of planet Earth, waiting for 10,000 people. If you go to MAPS conferences, it's very funny because the scientists, they present the data, and then the qualitative and the quantitative, and all the public is cheering, yay! Like people go to conferences as if they were going to a soccer match, and they're so happy to see that science is proving that their psychedelic use is really legit. So there is this fusion, like psychedelic users are begging for the scientists to show what they feel, what they experience. So it's a very hybrid context of a science that has a science, but has also a lounge. This is the field of psychedelic science. This mix of science, spirituality, indigenous people, scientists, queer people, academic researchers, that's our tent. This is this movement. And so I want to invite everybody to this next conference. And I also want to say my traditional jokes. I like to tell jokes, as you can all see, but I repeat some. Those of us that tell jokes do repeat jokes too. That's known. I don't think that psychedelics are addictive, but studying psychedelics is definitely addictive. So I have published 24 books in 24 years. And for me, there is no distinction, because these things, once you take them, you drink them, or you smoke them, or whatever you do to them, it's just so fascinating and so overwhelming and so beyond everything that for me, with a curious mind, I want to understand. So I want to study and I want to try to figure it out. For me, that scientific pursuit is an existential pursuit, is a form of spirituality, is a form of humanitarianism and activism. It's all together. So I think we have to go beyond these tensions and embrace these tensions and use the categories we have, because our understanding is very limited. We can have 50 words to describe a car and 2 words to describe a psychedelic experience, because our language, our understanding, our culture doesn't give us the tools. We're not trained to go into these realms. Our culture is incredibly under-resourced to understand non-rational, vigilant, waken up states of mind. But those states of mind are just little piece of the global opportunities of state of mind that we as humans are offered. So there is dreaming, there is being sick is an experience, is a state of mind. Being inebriated, dreaming, being on psychedelics, there's multiple ways of understanding reality and not just rational scientific science.
Rachel.
Yeah, I think there's a tension, but it's not the false dichotomy of rational versus mystical or spiritual. I think that what everybody here has said is that that is a false dichotomy, and that when you use psychedelics for medicinal purposes, there is a spiritual component. And look at the elegant work that is coming out of Johns Hopkins that is trying to systematically study the spiritual and mystical aspects of psychedelics. So I don't think that's where the tension is. I think that the tension is just really between scientific research as maybe a proxy for rationality, I don't know, and this idea of generalizing from people's personal experiences and having the zeitgeist about psychedelics be based on very much on experiences of either individual or cultural, without the systematic process of study that research provides. So good researchers can study hard things. Good researchers can study ineffable things. We've seen this, that's happening now, and really good researchers can develop tools that don't exist to study things that haven't been studied before. I mean, those things that can happen, but I think we don't want to generalize from people's own personal experience what might happen to someone else. That's what we need systematic research for. We need science to help us understand what are kind of universal effects versus what are individual differences. And if we skip that step, if we run to advocacy, if we run to commercialization, if we run to legalization, without having the fundamental basis of understanding all of these different scientific components, this could end up being a dangerous shortcut that has a backlash to it. So I think that's where the tension is. Trying to make policy based on individual narratives or cultural narratives versus objective data. And the challenge is that we will have to develop new ways of looking at ineffable experiences in consciousness, and the current tools that we have might not cut it, and our current approaches for how we view how the brain works and how the mind works may be insufficient for what we need to do. But that's kind of the challenge. That's why I'm so excited about the work that we're going to be doing at Mount Sinai, because it's just a real challenge to figure out how we're going to do it, knowing that the current tools are probably not going to get us where we need to go, but knowing that we will need to have a science to support a lot of the things that are the global agenda of the psychedelic renaissance.
Wonderful. And we are running short on time. We could talk about these issues all day, but I'll just ask very quickly in closing, just for each of you very quickly, what psychedelic myth or piece of information, misinformation, would you most like to correct?
Okay, I'll start. That it's the pharmacologic effects of the drug that are going to provide the sole explanation for the effects of psychedelic medicines. And also that psychedelic medicines, when used without the context of integration or some ability to understand what has happened on a psychedelic journey, may not necessarily provide healing as a mental health treatment. And so the idea is really using the psychedelic as a tool to access things that are difficult to otherwise access, and not to passively rely on a medicine that is ingested to fix a problem.
Yeah, I love that. I think that two that are related to what Rachel just shared. One is that it's always fun. I think people put, like, when they hear drugs, they hear like hedonism, and they're like, oh, this is going to be a fun thing. And one of the most persuasive things I've seen when I'm working, in an advocacy position with legislators or professionals in other contexts is the feeling that people might be having fun while they're healing is like suddenly this very stigmatized thing. And so it's a lot of psychedelic therapy and psychedelic healing work is actually extremely challenging and difficult and painful while a person is going through it. And then on the flip side of that, I do actually think that there's a belief that you must fight and earn and suffer in order to heal. And I don't think that's true either. I think that many people actually do experience a lot of healing and transformation through joy and pleasure and environments that may not necessarily be seen as clinical. So I think that Rachel and my points maybe seem like they clash, but I actually think they work together really well, because I think so much of it is about that environment. But just those two things I think are important to know.
Bia.
You're muted, Bia.
When I go back to the debates that the missionaries were having when they arrived in Mexico, so Christian missionaries were having deep philosophical debates when they faced peyote, and one of the conversations they were having was, is this evidence, is this the devil itself, peyote, or is this more like the evidence that the devil has passed through here? So there were endless conversations to sort of identify, understanding what was peyote and the relationship to devil. And so I think that we're still legatory of all of those images that missionaries have put into our mind, and the Inquisition against indigenous people, against sacred plants, against other ways of knowing, against other systems of healing, are still really foundational to the way we think. And I want to conclude by saying that I'm very happy that I just hired an executive assistant. Her name is Alejandra, and she's 26, and she started Friday, and she told me that her landlord is texting her like crazy, telling her that she can't live there anymore because she started working for this institution that works with psychedelics. This is a true story, people. Alejandra, she's in a cafe today. Ironically, her landlord sent a few Chacruna papers as well, among the other bad ones that she sent. And she's like, but we're trying to educate. Chacruna is trying to educate. And So I just want to say, you know, from the missionaries to Alejandra, we're still faced in the moral graves that we put ourselves in, stigmatizing and not understanding psychedelics. It's 500 years of colonization. It's still happening. We still got work to do.
And last but not least, Angela.
So I think I'll just go big picture and say, generally, what I would like to see corrected is the fear of harm. It's really unwarranted. Psychedelics have been used in a respectful and safe manner for a really long time, and with really minimal negative impact. And that fear comes from the war on drugs, which is a bunch of archaic and moralistic scare tactics, basically, sold to us by people in power to protect us from having to look at our own xenophobia and to allow further colonialism by invading the countries where these substances come from in the name of that protection. You know, the war on drugs came right around the time of desegregation and all the social movements in the 60s and the 70s. And it's fabrication. It was and is a concerted effort to control the racial and social and cultural landscape of the US by marginalizing people of color, queers, people with disabilities, and by literally criminalizing the trauma that comes from marginalization. We've spent over $1 trillion on that fear at this point. And, you know, I think we could put our money somewhere else more useful.
Thank you all for the beautiful conversation. I'll now turn it over to Professor Mason Marks.
Thank you, Dustin.
Thank you,
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Dustin. Thank you to all our panelists. That was really outstanding. And I'm excited to introduce our second panel, which is focused on psychedelics, legislation, and regulation. We have an equally impressive lineup for you. Bye, everyone. Thanks so much. And that includes California Senator Scott Wiener, Sharon Sidhu from Numinous, Graham Boyd, and Dr. David Shurtleff. I think I'll now, we'll get started by giving each of our panelists 1 or 2 minutes to introduce themselves and mention anything that they think is particularly important given today's conversation. I think we'll start with Sharon and then move to Senator Wiener. Sharon, welcome.
Hi, thank you, Mark, and thank you for thank you, Mason, and thanks for the organizers for putting this together. So far, it's been a great conversation. This is the first time I've actually been to something that Rick has spoken to, so fantastic hearing from him. So my name again, Sharon Sidhu. I'm the Science Officer and General Manager here at Numinous Bioscience, which is actually a subsidiary of Numinous Health Wellness, and it is a publicly traded company that is has a number of clinics and is working towards offering psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. We have clinics already offering ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, and we have many therapists in our network who are working towards a change in regulations, constant conversations with Health Canada, briefing notes to them about special access. So we're kind of in the pit of things here. We are based in Canada. I myself am based at the lab on the island, Vancouver Island. So we work with the Canadian regulations. We have a lot of communications, obviously, with the FDA. What I do is oversee policy and regulations as it pertains to the controlled drugs and substances, which is what psychedelics fall under here in Canada. And I pretty much look after all the licensing, regulations, communications with Health Canada. I have been in regulations and policy for the last 15 years, as well as worked kind of in the hub of industry, academia, and governance to commercialize products whilst following the regulations And this is very interesting for me because I've always been in that high growth, high risk industry. And so psychedelics was definitely attractive for what I've been doing in the past. Every industry I've been in has always had always been in a regulatory flux, this one being one of them. And you know, the attraction to moving into psychedelics is, you know, we're talking about making a major change to the health of many people that need it and to the populace as a whole. So again, very glad to be here.
Thank you, Sharon. Senator Wiener, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Good to see everyone. So I'm Scott Wiener. I serve in the California State Senate representing San Francisco and the northern part of San Mateo County. I do a lot of work around drug policy and drug sentencing reform, as well as around expanding access to mental health and addiction treatment. And psychedelics sort of sits at the crossroads of those various policy goals, and so it was really a no-brainer for me. We are working very hard to try to end the war on drugs, which we heard from the last panel, of course, is a completely artificial construct that really erases a lot of cultures, but also, of course, is incredibly racist and has fueled mass incarceration of Black and brown communities. And so we need to stop trying to arrest and incarcerate our way out of drug use. It doesn't work. Drugs are a health issue, not a criminal justice issue. And with psychedelics, of course, we have all the benefits for mental health and well-being. My first interaction with the issue was a while back, maybe 10 or 15 years ago. A former colleague of mine and his wife, their teenage son, became addicted to heroin. They tried absolutely everything. They had resources and tried anything that money could buy in terms of trying to help him get well and to stop using, and everything failed. And they, out of desperation, eventually sent him down to an ibogaine program in Mexico. He went through that program and has not used heroin since. So we know that these drugs are incredibly powerful in so many ways, that they can be, of course, any substance can be misused, but they can be used in a safe and healthy way, and we need to empower that. And so I'm authoring Senate Bill 519, which would decriminalize the possession and use for personal use and sharing of psychedelics. We made a lot of progress this year, moved it almost all the way through the entire legislature. We realized at the end that we needed more time to build support in the Assembly. And so we made it what's called a 2-year bill. So it'll come up again for hopefully those final couple steps next year. Have a great coalition of advocates of many, many stripes, including veterans and parents and Indigenous practitioners, and just an amazing group of people. And so we're going to keep fighting the fight.
Thank you, Senator. We will go to next to Graham and then to Dr. Shurtleff.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here, and especially to be on this panel with these other great folks in our movement. Thanks so much for inviting me. A bit of background about me. About 25 years ago, I founded the National ACLU's Drug Law Reform Project, a project dedicated to ending the war on drugs for all the reasons that our other panelists have already stated. And the one that particularly has motivated me then and now is about the racial disparities and what I see as just the continuing legacy of slavery and Jim Crow that our drug law regime has imposed through incarceration and denial of housing and education and so many other basic fundamental parts of participating in society. So I ran the ACLU project for about 15 years and argued cases in the Supreme Court and courts all around the country, shifting some of the rules around how the drug laws function. proud of that work, but also realized that it was limited, that we really needed to change the laws themselves. And so I've worked for the past 10 years more as a political organizer and activist than as a litigator. And in particular have organized and run most of the state ballot initiatives to change the cannabis laws. So I've been involved in 21 campaigns so far of change the laws, both for recreational or adult use marijuana and medical marijuana in a number of states through using that tool, the ballot initiative. And only recently did I start to really look at psychedelics as an area where both we could be undoing the war on drugs, but also proactively building up a healing modality and an infrastructure for bringing healing to people. In other words, tearing down the bad, but also building up the good. And I have been happy to be able to work with Senator Wiener and his staff and others to support the California effort. And I've also played a fairly central role in Oregon in passing the Oregon Psilocybin Program Initiative, which was on the ballot in November of last year. And the Oregon voters enacted that. And I think that's probably the main thing that I would be talking about on this panel, is how this state law creates permission under Oregon law, not federal law, just under Oregon law, for people to have access to psilocybin in a therapeutic context. Importantly, that's not just a medical context. So I would contrast this to the FDA approval route that it will lead to prescription use for some psychedelics. This is actually for people who don't necessarily have a medical diagnosis, but who would benefit from supervised therapeutic access to psilocybin. So that's the system that is coming into existence in Oregon and will be launched and ready to begin in January of 2023. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Graham. Dr. Shurtleff, welcome.
Thank you, Mason. It's a pleasure to be here, part of this panel. So I'm representing NCCIH, the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health. I'm Deputy Director and Acting Scientific Director at NCCIH. And for those of you who may not know, NCCIH is part of the National Institutes of Health. And we're the world's leading research organization with our overall mission to seek fundamental knowledge about nature, behavior, and living systems, and to apply that knowledge to enhance health, lengthen life, reduce illness and disability. And we're kind of a unique organization within the NIH in that we're not particularly focused on any one disease or condition. Our primary interest is to study complementary approaches that can promote health and manage a variety of conditions. We're primarily focused on pain, and I can talk more about that later, but also stress, anxiety, depression. And when I refer to complementary approaches, I'm really referring to dietary interventions, that's a study of natural products, including cannabinoids, and for the purpose of this discussion, psilocybin, dietary supplements, herbs, probiotics, microbial therapies as well. And in addition, we're interested in mind and body interventions and the study of yoga, Tai Chi, dance therapies, some forms of art therapy, meditation, hypnosis, relaxation therapies, acupuncture, massage, and spinal manipulation. Again, in the context of promoting health and treating disease and other conditions. So with that, I'll stop and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much. So I have a series of questions for you, and anyone is welcome to chime in. I may direct some questions to each of you at some point. But I just want to start off with a discussion of prohibition that dates back to the 1970s, which effectively shut down all scientific research for a matter of decades. And I want to ask you, what kind of effect do you think that had on the science, and what can we learn from that period moving forward to make sure that perhaps we don't make certain mistakes again?
I can go first. So so just from context, as we're a research organization, and we do benchtop research here as well as clinical research. And from my perspective, it is a matter of like if I look at things how they would normally happen, science comes first, recognizes a need, and fills a gap, right? This has happened the other way around. So the gap has been recognized, it's already being filled, and the science has come later. So it's here in Canada, you know, the regulatory hoops and hurdles that you have to go through to be able to do research on psychedelic compounds and narcotics it's quite extensive, like it is in the US. And we are lucky that we have a license so we can do that research. But then all of the academic institutes that want to do that research have to be able to acquire materials from a regulated facility. Again, we're now seeing academia filling those gaps and starting that research. But I do feel that, you know, the product development is already way ahead of the primary research that normally gets initiated, where a gap or a need or even just a query is seen by researchers. So I definitely think it's held that back a little bit. I think if we had more research, more primary research done, where there was more, you know, inquiries that were reviewed by academia, that we would probably be further ahead.
Thank you. Anyone else like to comment on what we can learn from prohibition moving forward with future psychedelics legislation?
Well, Mason, I'll just say briefly that I think an important part of your question is why did the backlash happen in the first place? And what are we doing now to insulate against that backlash or potentially to promote it? And I do think it's important to be mindful. Well, let me say this, it's not just that I think this. So I've done a good deal of public opinion research with focus groups around the country and polling. And one of the things I can say is that those of us who are very interested in psychedelics live in something of a bubble where we're talking to one another. And it's important to be mindful that the rest of the world, the rest of the country, voters in particular, don't necessarily share all of our assumptions and ways of thinking about this. And so as we advance forward, I think trying to stay tethered to information that can be validated by evidence is important. Going purely on anecdote can kind of get us out over our skis a little bit. Even though anecdote is certainly how we can learn, but in terms of that public narrative, and in particular, not falling into the mode of talking about any of these substances as being panaceas, as cure-alls, to sort of stay in that balanced place of saying that based on research, there's tremendous promise, that we are in a mental health crisis, that where there is promise, it deserves to be explored. But I think to the general public, if we start saying this is the answer to everything, and if only everybody could take psychedelics and the world would be filled with peace and harmony, is I think setting us up for a kind of backlash. Related to that, there'll be some people who end up experiencing harm, and psychedelics will be part of the story. And we can't pretend that won't happen. And I think that's why data collection is incredibly important. In the Oregon context, if there ends up being 1 or 2 or 3 incidences of something going wrong, if we have a data set that shows that there are 10,000 incidents of nothing going wrong, or indeed some things going really well, that puts it in context. So the bad anecdote can actually be quite harmful too. So all of that is really part of my answer of saying, like, let's not have another backlash where we experience another generation of no scientific research and just arrest and incarceration instead.
I think that it's really important when we're having these conversations with people, and I found this when I talked to my colleagues or others, when people express concerns that, oh, if you take LSD, you're going to have flashbacks, or you're going to, this harm or that harm. And of course, we remind them that, you can have harm from any substance, including substances you buy over the counter in a drugstore. And so this is not unique to any one substance. But I try to always bring it back to people that, okay, you can have whatever opinion you want about whether people should use psychedelics and what circumstances, et cetera. But the question for you is, should we be arresting and incarcerating people for possessing and using these drugs? You can love them or hate them. But is that the right approach to be arresting and incarcerating people for this? And the answer is almost always no, we shouldn't be doing that. And then I say, well, that's in terms of what we're doing here, that's sort of the end of the inquiry, because we're trying to decriminalize and move away from a war on drugs approach. And I think it's really important to bring it back to that. When people say, I'm worried that my kid is going to use psychedelics, I always say, well, your kid can use psychedelics right now. And people of all ages are using psychedelics right now, whether or not it's legal or whether or not it's legal. And the question is, do you want your kid to be arrested for using the psychedelics or not arrested? And then it's like, well, of course I don't want my kid to be arrested. So I try to bring it back to that very foundational question.
Yeah, I think to just pick up on that point of what Graham said, I think the research is critically important. Rigorous, objective research is really that's unbiased. I think that's really going to get us out of this conundrum of thinking about this drug in certain ways. And I think about looking back on the 60s and 70s, look at my own field of neuroscience. The Society for Neuroscience only started in 1969. So it was sort of at the tail end of the war on drugs. And I think what the brain science is showing us is how these drugs work in the brain, the mechanisms, how they affect behavior, how they affect mood, how they affect brain mechanisms. I think that gives us a grounding for better able to discuss what these drugs do and how they work. And it takes away maybe some of the stigma associated with these compounds. The brain doesn't know from legal or illegal. It just, there's mechanisms in the brain that we need to understand and study and be able to convey that in an objective manner.
Yeah, I think I would agree with David. Any argument or any case that we make with governing bodies has to be backed up with robust scientific data. Subjective data and anecdotal data won't work.
That's true for regulatory bodies, and
yes.
But in terms of decriminalization, I really want to make sure we're separating that out. Yes, of course, we're going to make the case that these drugs can have significant benefits, but I also never want to fall into the trap in the decriminalization process that you have to show a benefit in order to not arrest and incarcerate someone. Because I also think, for other drugs that, methamphetamine, I think the world would be a better place if meth just evaporated and didn't exist. But it does, and we shouldn't be arresting and incarcerating people for it, even though it doesn't have very many benefits, and it's a deeply harmful substance.
I want to pick up on something you just mentioned, Senator Wiener, about having to show a medical benefit in order to not arrest people and put them in prison. And that seems to be the system that we have now, because with the scheduling process, you need to show medical evidence, probably from phase 2 trials at least, in order to change the law so that people are not incarcerated. So I think that psychedelics are really drawing attention to that that situation that was created in the 70s. And there increasingly seems to be bipartisan support for focusing on research to make these medical therapies, as well as potentially for decriminalization. How might we capitalize on that to prevent this backlash, this potential backlash that Graham mentioned?
I mean, I think it's hard because in conversations with colleagues, policymakers, sometimes they say, well, this should just all be done through the FDA, or this should be done all through the medical pharmaceutical process, and I which is not, I think, the right way to do it in terms of course, decriminalization. And I think also that there are some drug policy advocates who are not skeptical, but are not enthusiastic cheerleaders of decriminalizing psychedelics. I mean, they support decriminalizing psychedelics, but they worry that you start cherry picking. Oh, these are the good drugs, so we're going to decriminalize those. We're not going to decriminalize the bad drugs. And so I try to always, in my messaging around this bill and this issue, talk about how this is a step, and we need to be broadly decriminalizing drug use and possession. And this is not about, good drugs versus bad drugs.
I just want to, I want to agree with that and really say, Mason, to the sort of premise of your question that there needs to be some medical evidence before decriminalization can proceed. Absolutely not. I think decriminalization, there's a fundamental question of when someone is using a substance for whatever reason, recreationally, for fun, for distraction, for treatment of something, when someone's using that substance, is any good accomplished by arresting that person? And I mean, there's just not. I think the idea that we would arrest people comes more from moral panic than it does from any notion of good public policy. I think it gets more nuanced and complicated when you talk about people who are involved in or who want to be involved in producing or selling different drugs. And my view is there's not a one size fits all solution. I think that depending on the nature of the substance, and here's where science really does come in, there are different solutions that may or may not be better. And I think we should go a step at a time and kind of see what works. And by works, I mean what is going to maximize the good and minimize the harm from the policy solution that's chosen. We've got now a bit of a track record around one model that for cannabis of essentially a commercial product that's available to adults who want to use it. You can just go and buy and do what you want to with it. I tend to think that's not the right model for methamphetamine or fentanyl. And I'm not even sure it's the right model for psychedelics. But the point is, let's try to bring wise people together and come up with what good models might be. And that's what Oregon represents. That's one model where there is access for adults to psilocybin, not just for medical purposes, but with a different kind of oversight and regulation than exists for cannabis. And I think we'll learn a lot from that. We should gather the data, see what works and what doesn't, and eventually get to the point where in the near term, as Senator Wiener says, people just shouldn't be arrested for their individual or even group use of something. But then when we think about the larger supply issues and production issues, let's be smart about it and come up with something that's actually good for society and good for people, and that ultimately doesn't involve incarceration as a tool.
I want to bring in some audience questions. We have a question from Danny Winton. How can patients be protected from unqualified or unethical psychiatrists, therapists, and providers? So what is the role of regulation there? And then on the other side of things, we had another question about in reference to the REMS that Rick Doblin mentioned that the FDA is requiring. These are extra requirements for administration of MDMA that will be required, extra training and safeguards. So is it possible to go a little bit too far on the other side of things by requiring too much regulation to protect people?
Well, I think one of the things we do in SB 519 is we also create a working group to make further recommendations to the legislature beyond straight up decriminalization. And one of the areas that I think is really important to explore is the possibility of having some sort of certification for therapists, for example, who can help people with psychedelic therapy. I don't pretend to be an expert in the area, but I think that, and I know that there are sort of right now underground programs where people go and get that training, but it'd be great for consumers to be able to say, okay, this person has, whether it doesn't have to even be a government some sort of marker where they know this is someone who knows what they're doing.
Yeah, we've got obviously there are training programs that are available through MAPS for MDMA, but Numinous is developing training for therapists for CAP as well as psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy. And it's vetted through our most experienced therapists, so Devon Christie and Evan Woods. And, you know, it's a very rigorous process that they're going through to develop these protocols. We have therapists that are very well versed in delivering therapy, psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. Joe Flanders, who runs our Montreal clinic, he is very experienced in ketamine assisted therapy, so is Devon. So we're drawing from some real world expertise in delivering these therapists, as well as, you know, the therapists that have that are selected to be trained have to have a baseline requirements to be able to go through the training program as well. Is it standardized? Not yet, especially not here in Canada. Are we looking at standardizing these therapies and getting certificates for them? I mean, yes, the discussions happened, but it's a very long, rigorous process.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. This is, when you think about the use of psilocybin or MDMA or some of these compounds, it's medication-assisted therapy. So a big component of this is the therapeutic behavioral intervention. And that's needs to be studied in and of itself. How do these two elements, the pharmacology of the drug and the intervention, the psychotherapy, the behavioral intervention, work together? And how is that protocolized, and how are people trained and licensed to do this work? So it all goes hand in hand with studying, doing the research on both the pharmacotherapy and the behavioral intervention. And if you look at the study that NIDA just funded with Matt Johnson, it's for smoking cessation, but it's using a CBT model as well as psilocybin. So it's that combination that's critical. And as was pointed out, how you protocolize, as Sharon pointed out, that intervention, so it's standardized across treatments, I think is another step in implementation of these therapies, which is another whole area of research, by the way, is implementation research.
Yeah, it is. There's still a lot of work to do.
I'm curious to know what you think right now are some of the largest legal obstacles to advancing the science as well as advancing decriminalization, either here in the US, in Canada, or even internationally.
For me, it's...
Oh, anyone who'd like to take it, certainly.
It's, for me, it's actually cost, right? Research is expensive, right? And I think you'll see that across the board, where, you know, obviously clinical research is expensive, benchtop research is expensive, and we want to do so much research in so many different substances. It's pretty much picking where you put your resources and what would have the most value. And then also we're developing products for therapy, but we're also cognizant of the cost of that product as well. So we're trying to find efficiencies in that cost per unit while still maintaining quality and while still maintaining safety and efficacy, to be able to offer that at a reasonable cost, right? So definitely for me, it's the cost, which is the obstacles. Again, as far as regulations go, we're working with the regulators right now to make sure that we're on the right path. But the risk is that those regulations might change and we'll have to pivot.
So Mason, to your question of what's the largest legal impediment, it depends on the change you're talking about. There really isn't a legal impediment to ending the arrest of people who use psychedelics. It's a political one. Each state fully has the power to change its law, and municipalities have the power to instruct their police to deprioritize arresting people for using psychedelics. That politically, there are some very serious obstacles to that happening, but legally there's not. And the fact that it remains illegal under federal law doesn't really matter within that arena, because the federal police force, the DEA, doesn't bother itself with arresting people for personal possession of psychedelics. However, if you're looking at how do you create a broader system of meaningful, safe access to psychedelics, then the largest impediment is federal law. If you want to do that consistently with federal law, the only avenue is either to change federal law, which I think is politically not going to happen in the near future, or to get approval from the FDA, the sort of route that Rick Doblin was discussing. But that's only a narrow form of access. That's for people who have a medical diagnosis and who are having access through a physician. So broader access requires doing something like we're doing in Oregon, where you change state law, you go ahead and do it despite the fact that federal law doesn't allow it, and then hope for some kind of political accommodation. But the real obstacle there is federal law itself.
With Oregon's new laws and potentially California having new laws as well very soon and others potentially following suit, what would be the best case scenario for potential collaboration with the federal government and federal agencies? What might that actually look like in an ideal situation?
I think for California law, I mean, Senator Wiener, you should probably speak to this for yourself, but I don't think the federal government really matters if you're talking about just California stopping arresting people. They can just do that. I think the later stage of once the study commission happens and we come up with a broader avenue of therapeutic use in California, that ends up raising the same questions that Oregon raises right now, which is, will the federal government step in? And they do have the power to do so, and enjoin or through law enforcement cause to stop the people who want to open up and start providing psilocybin therapy. That could happen. I think the reason it wouldn't happen is because the U.S. attorney, the chief prosecutor in Oregon, or the Department of Justice itself looks at the situation and says, this is actually an improvement in terms of federal interests. And here I'll draw the parallel to cannabis. In the early days of cannabis legalization, the federal government very actively tried to stop both first medical and then eventually adult use activities, dispensaries, that sort of thing. And even in the earliest days, tried to stop doctors from recommending medical marijuana. I litigated a case in 1998 called Keynote versus Walters that established a First Amendment right for doctors to be able to recommend marijuana. What eventually shifted is, I think, that policy makers in the Department of Justice realized that a regulated system of access to cannabis was better than letting the cartels decide for themselves how they wanted to distribute cannabis. So that's a little bit of a messy answer to the question, but I will say this, that the federal interest around psilocybin in Oregon is not about protecting the health and safety of patients. That's what the FDA does. But what the DEA does is to try to disrupt drug trafficking. And the system of Oregon regulated access for psilocybin through state licensed clinics is actually consistent with the federal interest. And so I think it's very likely that the Department of Justice will not interfere with that system.
Senator Wiener, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more just about the genesis of SB 519, some of the changes it's gone through and what you hope for its future.
Well, the genesis is, as I mentioned at the beginning, I do a fair amount of drug policy work in various respects. Sorry, the light just went off in my office. And so what we were watching, what was happening in Oregon and elsewhere, and decided, let's explore this in California. In terms of the bill, I think the significant changes that happened to the bill is we were sort of forced to remove ketamine. Ketamine was always the go-to drug for the opposition, referring to it as a quote unquote date rape drug, even though we disagreed with that characterization and constantly remind them that the ultimate date rape drug is alcohol, and you're not banning that. But that became a narrative, and we realized that having ketamine in the bill unfortunately threatened to drag the whole bill down. the bill would have died, would not made it as far as it did. And given that ketamine is the psychedelic that is currently actually prescribable, we decided that reluctantly that we would remove it from the bill. We also, in the Assembly Health Committee, the committee and the chair wanted us to put volume limits or quantity limits in terms of what would be decriminalized. The bill always effectively had quantity limits because we were not decriminalizing possession with intent to sell, which can really only be determined by the volume of drugs that you possess. But it was more subjective. What a police officer or a court decides is enough to infer intent to sell. So we worked with our coalition, and we posed, we didn't, it wasn't our preference to put volume limits in, but given that the committee insisted on it, we suggested what those would be if they were going to insist on it, and they accepted that. And so we put that into the bill. Those were the two, I think, significant changes, and neither one was surprising. I will also just say one point of contention that's been from the beginning is how to treat peyote. And it was not a fight that I was looking to be involved with or in the center of, but unfortunately it was just, it became an issue. There were just a dispute among advocates about whether peyote should be decriminalized or not. There were people, including the Native American Church, who believed that it should not be included in the bill because it would lead to peyote tourism. And there are already federal protections for practitioners, for indigenous practitioners. There were other advocates who thought it should absolutely be decriminalized. So we ultimately did not include peyote in the bill. Mescaline from other plants is decriminalized, but not peyote. And that's just been a continuing source of disagreement, and we did the best that we could on it.
Thank you for that explanation. I want to turn a little bit more to the role of federal agencies. We've talked a little bit about the FDA and the DEA. And I'm curious to ask you, Dr. Shurtleff, a little bit more about the role of the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health in this landscape.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's more that, we're a biomedical research organization within the federal government. We're not a regulatory agency. So our goal really is to provide the scientific evidence that informs people on this panel and informs decisions that they make as policymakers. We also provide objective research information that helps inform the public and healthcare professionals. So that's really goes along with our mission to, to improve the public health. It also, it's part of our mission is to inform key decision makers and helping them, use the information we provide in developing their laws and policies that are put in place. So we're, I guess, one step removed from the policy making, but I hope we have, I hope the information we do provide is useful and used in that regard. And just in general, as NCCIH, we are a little different from most of the other institutes at the NIH. We are more on the behavioral health approach. We're interested in promoting health, whole person health, a holistic approach to health. And we are very much interested in natural products. And I think if you look at cannabis or cannabinoids, we have a robust research program on cannabinoids, particularly for the management of pain. We do a lot of epidemiological work, and we look to see how people are using these compounds. And if you look at cannabis, the major reason people report use of cannabis is for management of pain. And then the question is, can we build on that observational research to further study what are the analgesic properties of cannabinoids? How can we better, and we do take a more of a drug development approach. How can we then take what we know, what the public is saying, and develop and optimize medications for the management of pain. And that, I think pain is particularly in the forefront of everything right now for us because of the opioid crisis, the pain crisis in the United States, overdose deaths occurring with opioids. We need other approaches to manage pain, and certainly cannabinoids provide one approach along with our mind-body interventions. The main reason people seek out complementary approaches such as chiropractic or Tai Chi or acupuncture is for the management of pain, but we still need to learn more about how they work and how we can optimize those therapies as well. And then in terms of psilocybin specifically, we've had an inquiry from a number of investigators who are interested in exploring psilocybin and its role for management of chronic pain, managing pain catastrophizing, which is a major component of pain management. So we touch every aspect of this discussion in terms of providing the evidence and the research needed to move policy forward, but we're not policy makers, if that makes sense.
Thank you. We have a question from Nabil Al-Khaled on rescheduling, and they're commenting on Rick Doblin's presentation regarding how MDMA would be rescheduled once it becomes FDA approved. In that case, there would be a currently accepted medical use that would require it to be removed from Schedule 1. Is psilocybin likely to follow a similar path, or is there any universe in which it could potentially be rescheduled before FDA approval?
I'm not from the FDA, but I can just comment on, for example, Epidiolex or CBD. Once that became FDA approved for the treatment of epilepsy, rare forms of childhood epilepsy, it was rescheduled as a Schedule 7 compound. So I think that is the key to getting these compounds rescheduled, is to show medical use or benefit, and then that it follows from there that the drug will need to be rescheduled based on discussions with FDA and the DEA.
Mason, I'll take your question. I don't think there's any realistic prospect that psilocybin gets rescheduled prior to FDA action. And also, just to clarify for folks, the rescheduling that is likely to happen for MDMA, and I hope eventually for psilocybin, will probably look a lot like what happened with GHB, which is to say that that when that molecule is manufactured by the pharmaceutical company and supplied to doctors and from doctors to patients, then that version of the drug, so this is true for GHB today, that version of GHB is legal. But if you make GHB yourself, or some chemist makes it and you get it from them, that GHB, even though it's chemically identical, is actually still Schedule 1 and illegal. And that's probably what the world will look like around MDMA in the near future too, that the MDMA that's manufactured by MAPS, supplied through its supply chain eventually to physicians who prescribe it to patients who consume it in a therapy room under the supervision of a therapist, will be 100% legal. But the MDMA that you might get from somewhere else would still be just as criminal.
You bring up a really good point. I like to point out that THC right now exists in 3 different schedules, in Schedule 2 and 3, because there are 2 FDA approved medications that contain it. And then of course in Schedule 1 in its natural form in cannabis. And you bring up a good point that once Oregon's system comes online in 2023, even if Compass's psilocybin was to become FDA approved, that would be a different formulation, a different set of requirements than the Oregon system. I think some people might have a misunderstanding that somehow they will be merged together, but they will in fact be distinct. But this conversation just reminds me of something we touched on earlier that Senator Wiener mentioned, that this seems to be a problem, that in order to make something no longer a felony at the federal level, we need to establish medical efficacy, which seems strange. So is there any way that we could address that just from a broader perspective in terms of the scheduling process under the Controlled Substances Act? What can we learn from this obvious problem to potentially improve the law moving forward?
Well, I mean, Congress could restructure the drug laws and make them rational, and that'd be great. I'm not holding my breath. And there's struggles to do things like the debt ceiling, but you know, that's something that I think that should be a project, long-term project, to rationalize the federal drug laws. Because I agree, it shouldn't just be, okay, if you have one particular formulation of one particular drug that the FDA approves, and then your doctor can prescribe it to you and you won't get arrested for that. But for anything else, you still get arrested.
I mean, the other route that I'm a little bit more hopeful of, not tomorrow, but sometime, is that rescheduling can happen either by congressional action or by executive action. So technically, the head of the DEA can initiate rescheduling. And, you know, the president that we have now and his views on drugs, I'm not holding my breath on that either. But I guess I want to paint a slightly rosier picture that, say, 4 years from now, we do have prescription access to MDMA and to psilocybin and potentially to other substances, that not just Oregon and then California, but let's say a dozen states have created well-structured, regulated systems for access where the sky hasn't fallen and people are being helped. I think at that point, you could make the case to the Attorney General and to the head of the DEA that it's time to actually reschedule these substances across the board. That doesn't seem crazy to me. And even the fact that the current head of the DEA, Ann Milgram, who was the Attorney General of New Jersey before she got appointed by President Biden, she had worked before that as the head of philanthropy at a foundation that actually is very involved actively in drug policy reform, the Arnold Foundation. So, you know, I think it's by far the most hopeful DEA administrator that has been named in my lifetime. And so I want to kind of dream into the possibility that we'll live into a world in which there are reasonable people in charge of these agencies who will make good decisions that are different than the ones being made today.
Thank you, Graham. What could we learn from other countries? So, you know, Canada would be an obvious, a good comparison here. But what can we learn from their legislation?
So the biggest difference here is federal. Like our controlled drugs and substances are controlled federally. So it's, you know, the way they're implemented, you know, as we saw with cannabis, can be different provincially, but really it is the federal government that controls what we do with these compounds. From a therapeutic and if it ever happens, a recreational purpose, right? So really, Numinus's lens is therapy, it's treatment. So we're not really involved in, you know, any kind of conversation as far as recreational magic mushrooms, for example. We're not involved in any of that. We're purely focused on therapy. But like I said, we're in the realm of federal regulations. We're in conversations with the federal government, as opposed to, you know, so obviously there's lobbying at a provincial level. But as far as what we do here for research, product development, drug development, it's all at a federal level. I don't know, you know, I've had dealings with the FDA as well. And what I can say is that, you know, the Health Canada is listening, right? They are listening. We do have open conversations. They are looking at what we do with, you know, under a microscope, because we're one of the only ones that are doing it at the level, at this level. And we're constantly going back and forth about how to set things up, how to make things more efficient, how we make our reporting more smooth. So they are listening, and that is very hopeful for us.
The thing I'm excited about from Canada is the access for people who have a terminal diagnosis through the exemption 56 route. So there's a lawsuit that is pending right now in the Ninth Circuit that is pushing that boundary a little bit under US law. I don't think that lawsuit is by itself going to open the door completely, but I mean, this is very innovative that Canada allows for a medical provider to petition to the federal health ministry to have a patient have access to psilocybin. And we do know from the polling in the United States and just from a number of interactions with policymakers that the palliative care end of life route of access is one that's particularly easy as a first step. So again, kind of dreaming into a future of federal change, that might be the thing that could be changed in the first instance to allow for access for palliative and end of life care.
Yeah. So interestingly, great system to be able to provide under an exemption. However, right now, because of the first few exemptions that were granted, Health Canada is actually inundated right now with exemption requests. So it's actually kind of, I don't want to say made it more difficult, but it has made them look at this. It is both good and bad, right? So yes, it's holding up the system for being able to issue the exemptions. At the same time, because there is such a demand for them, because they've already set a precedence, they are looking at this as there's an actual need, there is a demand, what can be done. There is also a discussion about N of 1 trials, where you actually have, it's almost like a clinical trial application, but it's for one patient, which are, there is rumor that it's an actual quicker process given the queue for exemption reviews. At the same time, we also know that the Office of Clinical Trials is inundated with applications for clinical trials. So we're just in this constant circle. So something clearly needs to be done because right now there is a lot of interest in psychedelics for research and development. There's a lot of interest from a therapist point of view, and there's also a lot of interest from a patient point of view. And, we have seen a couple of exemptions going in for more than palliative care. So again, there's a demand, and hopefully that will show the government that something needs to be done.
I want to be respectful of everyone's time, but I do want to give you an opportunity to leave us with some parting thoughts. So I'd like to give you a chance to just express what you think is most important in this rapidly evolving landscape.
I'll jump in first. I think change at the state law level is what's most important. One of the hats I wear is running a sort of political advocacy organization called New Approach. And we are actively gearing up to look at supporting state legislative efforts like Senator Wiener's in California and ballot measures like the one in Oregon. And I think over the next 5 years, we're going to change the laws. Broadly, this community will change the laws in probably a dozen states. So I'm very excited about that. And for people out there in the audience who are looking to participate in that as lawyers who want to be involved in drafting or activists who want to be involved in any way, come join us. I think it's going to be a lot of fun and we're going to really make a big difference.
Thank you, Graham.
Yeah, for us, I think the research continues. I think it's we're getting a lot of interest in, especially around psilocybin. The work is continuing about the basic and the clinical research levels. I think we're going to learn a lot more about this interesting natural product and provide additional evidence that will drive policy and use in the future. So I'm very excited about where the research is going.
From my perspective, I think is to recognize that no one's going to be able to do this alone, and that collaboration and discussion is going to be very important.
Senator Wiener, any parting thoughts?
No, I think it's all been said. I think this is going to have to start bottom up from the cities and the states, and hopefully one day we'll make a breakthrough with the federal government. It's been very slow going with cannabis, but there have been little glimmers of hope, and I suspect that we could see a breakthrough in Congress at some point. But you know, it's a bottoms up kind of situation.
Well, I'm sure I speak for everyone when I thank you all for the important work you're doing in your different facets of this landscape. And I'm very grateful that you were able to join us here today. I want to thank all of our panelists, all of our attendees. Thanks so much for participating in what was a very productive and fascinating conversation. Thanks so much. And I hope you'll follow our future events and other academic projects. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.